to episode 143 of the CRICKETher Weekly. You join us in the middle of a very, very, very cold snap in the UK.
We're not just talking about our economy.
For those of you who are listening only, I am wearing a very thick scarf. For some odd reason, Sid is in short sleeves because he apparently is a robot who does not feel the cold. But trust me, it's cold. Sid, so we've been watching cricket this week and almost in disbelief that anyone could be playing cricket anywhere in the world when it is this cold. So let's talk
What's actually been happening?
Let's talk about England v West Indies first of all. Now we talked about the ODIs in last week's episode, but we've now had two T20s at the time of recording. And England have won both of them, so they're 2-0 up. I think by the time this goes out, the third one will have been played. I guess you'd probably say we're expecting England to win that third one as well, because they have been reasonably dominant, and there's been some very poor fielding by West Indies, I have to say. But there's been some interesting stuff going on, hasn't there? What have you made of it all so far?
Well, obviously, good wins for England, and they're definitely going to take the positives from that. I do just worry slightly that that maybe these wins should be bigger if we want to be up there. I mean, I did kind of mention this last week in the context of the ODIs. If we want to be up there with Australia and India, then these wins perhaps should be a little bit more convincing than they've been. The second T20 was interesting because England rested some players, didn't they, Raf? Including Amy Jones, who didn't play as the wicketkeeper for the first time in quite a long time. What did you make of that one?
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting because in the first T20, John Lewis did play Lauren Winfield-Hill at number 3, no less, as a pure batter. And he talked before the series about potentially shaking things up a bit. I thought that was really interesting. Kind of a bit odd because in domestic cricket, she always opens. For England, she had generally opened, although she'd also at one point dropped down the order and been a kind of late middle order batter. I've never seen her at number 3 before, I don't think. I can't recall it. So I thought that was an interesting move. And then in the second T20, she was batting at 3 again, and she was actually keeping wicket. Now, the official line on this is that Amy Jones was being rested, as a number of other players were, including Nat Siver. But I think it's an interesting one because you almost kind of go, for somebody who is keeping wicket and batting a bit, do they actually need to be rested per se? Or is it actually a kind of thing of the new coach coming along and going, well, you know what, Amy Jones, maybe you're not as undroppable as people have been assuming you are because we don't even have a backup wicketkeeper in our squad. And actually now we have got somebody who potentially can make a case for herself to play ahead of you if she's showing better form with the bat. Now, I think, I don't know that Lauren Winfield-Hill currently has done enough to sort of cement that case as herself. She hasn't had a spectacular innings. She really would have needed to hit at least a 50 probably in that game in order for that to be something that we might see. But I just think it was an interesting move, and I just think Amy Jones should be thinking very carefully about her place, and actually thinking, what do I need to do to make sure that I'm not kind of accidentally usurped, maybe.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like John Lewis maybe asserting a bit of authority, a little bit of a shot across the bows, as you say. I think the other interesting thing that in terms of selections is the way that with John Lewis now obviously responsible for those selections and working with the rest of the sort of senior management to make those selections, they really seem to have. Lauren Bell seems to have come in, and now she's like much more of she's the kind of person in the possession of the jersey in the sort of fast bowling role. Obviously for years and years and years, England, Anya Shrubsole and Catherine Brunt, if they were fit, they would almost certainly play. And then there's been a lot of other people that have come in and played the odd game here and there, but none of them have ever felt really sure of their place. It feels like we're getting towards a point where Lauren Bell's going to be able to feel pretty confident about her place, that she's going to play almost every game, perhaps going forwards. And she's had a good series.
I was just going to say she was kind of almost fighting it out a bit with Izzy Wong, wasn't she, over the summer in terms of who was going to be the sort of the challenger for that.
Yeah, and it feels like she's really kind of that John Lewis is really kind of gone, I think that you're going to be my number one at this stage. And what's interesting is the way that he's looking at that. Obviously, that she's had a good series, but it's been a very Lauren Bell series. There's been some poor overs. There's been some overs where the ball hasn't swung for her, and she still finds it difficult when the ball doesn't do what she wants it to do. And she's had the odd over where she's been knocked for a few runs. But on the other hand, someone like John Lewis, as a bowler himself, will be obviously able to look at that and go, yeah, okay, I can kind of parcel off the poor overs, and I can look at the other overs and see that her figures are really good in those other overs. I can see that one other thing that she's doing, something that I've banged on about for years, she's able to bowl that sort of magic delivery, and we've seen a few of those where the kind of delivery that's going to bowl any batter in the world, going to leave even
it's going to get Beth Mooney or Alyssa Healy out,
and that's what they really need her to be doing, and that's a price worth paying for the odd over that's going to go for 10 or 12, because at the end of the day, those overs that go for 10 or 12 do actually happen to anyone. They occasionally happen to people like Megan Shute as well. Even as much as the Shoots and the Caps of this world.
Well, she got hit for 20 in the Super Over the other day, didn't she? Which we'll come on to in a minute. I think you're absolutely right, and if they're going to talk the talk about being aggressive, they've got to walk the walk in a way, haven't they? I do think that's interesting. I guess in a way it kind of makes sense because it feels like in some ways Lauren Bell is a more natural successor to Anya Shrubsole, who's already retired, than Izzy Wong is because of the way she swings the ball. Whereas Izzy Wong is kind of more of if we're categorising her, she's more of the natural successor in a way to Catherine Brunt. And
she's the more sort of overtly aggressive.
Yeah, and Catherine Brunt has not yet retired and will, as much as we're aware, and assuming that she manages to stay fit, will be opening the bowling for England in the T20 World Cup in South Africa. So it looks like, at the moment, based on the selections, that it will be Catherine Brunt and Lauren Bell opening the bowling in T20. So that's interesting, isn't it? And you'll be happy.
Yeah. Okay.
And I like to pick up on something that you said, Sid, about the fact that you maybe would like to see England actually dominating a bit more, because that's something that I was thinking about watching that second T20. England were quite dominant in the first T20, but in the second T20, they only in inverted commas, made 141 runs. And actually, if you look at that in comparison to what's been happening in Australia v India, where we're getting scores of 170, 180, and actually those scores kind of almost, or in some cases successfully being chased down, then you kind of think England should really be hitting scores of 150, 160 plus, shouldn't they, against a West Indies side who have been really poor in the field.
Yeah, these haven't been the easiest pitches, is our understanding. There's the first few matches were played at a ground with very, very large outfields. Which obviously makes it harder to find the boundary, especially on difficult pitch. The second pitch is a bit stodgy, apparently. So there's you have to there's a little bit of mitigation there, but certainly you want England to be doing more to dominate a side like the West Indies, because the West Indies are definitely not in the top four sides anymore, and the England that we're looking for is one that can beat those top four sides, not just one that's going to smash around the likes of the West Indies and Pakistan. And unfortunately for the West Indies, it really is, as we discussed last week, they're much more down in that level, alongside competing with the Pakistans and the Sri Lankas, rather than up competing with England and Australia and India.
So you've been actually crunching some numbers on this, haven't you, in relation to Sophia Dunkley?
Yeah, I had a quick look at this, and I don't want to be overly negative about things, because obviously Dunks has put in a lot of runs for England, and she's faced a lot of balls for England in T20 cricket over the past year or so. And superficially she's done quite well, but when you actually compare her against the very best, she's just that little bit down. So compared to Smriti Mandhana and Beth Mooney and Talia McGrath, she's hitting a significantly lower strike rate. She's sitting at sort of 6-7 points lower than those batters. Okay. She's also scoring significantly less boundaries. So she's running a lot, and it has to be said, getting herself into trouble quite a lot. She's seemed to have been, anecdotally, I haven't looked at the numbers to be fair, but anecdotally it feels like she's been involved in a lot of run-outs.
I need to add Dunk's comedy run-out to my England cricket bingo card, don't I?
Yeah, so she's running hard. but that's kind of masking a real lack of boundaries. That she's just not scoring boundaries at the same rates as those very, very top players. And Talia McGrath's a particularly interesting example because she's in a sort of similar stage of her career to Sophia Dunkley. She's only just been established in the team, similar sort of age, in mid-20s. But McGrath is just like a level above in the number of balls she's hitting. She's hitting boundaries off like 5% more balls than Dunks is, and at the very highest levels again. And again, don't forget that we're talking about what it takes to match the very top teams.
Yeah.
Dunks just isn't quite delivering where we want her to be, and she really we'd love to see her take another step up because she's getting a lot of praise, but she shouldn't rest on her laurels about where she is at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think the difficulty is that a lot of the England batters are batting at a strike rate of 100. But if Australia and India are batting at a strike rate of 150, then that's no good. It's just not good enough anymore. So, what would have been fine 5 years ago just isn't. And England, and I'm guessing the coaches will be very well aware of this. England need to be careful they don't get left behind by Australia and India. Let's move on and talk then about Australia v India because that's obviously been going on at the same time. Unfortunately, we've not been able to watch it in the UK.
We'll come back to this a little bit later in the show.
We've seen a few highlights, and we've obviously been reading some of the live commentary on CRICKETher, etc., and kind of following what's going on. So at the moment, again, this is at the time of recording, and will probably be out of date by the time the episode's actually released. This current scoreline is 2-1 to Australia in the T20 series. And that's very interesting because they have suffered their first defeat. I think it's their first defeat in any format of cricket in the whole of 2022. Yeah. And we're nearly at the end of the year. So that is just ridiculous. But congratulations to India for handing it to them. Very, very well deserved by India. As I say, it all came down to that super over. And India came out and smashed 20 runs off Megan Shoot, which is not something that we see very often. And Australia just couldn't quite match them. But what an amazing game of cricket, Sid.
Well, what an amazing series it's been. It feels like two kind of superpowers going toe to toe, really. And I was reminded of it's like India versus Australia. It's Alien versus Predator. and this is actually there's something to this. Bear with me.
Okay.
Alien versus Predator, the kind of strap line was whoever wins, we lose. Now, with India and Australia battling it out at the very highest levels, whoever wins, you feel like England lose. And because England's claim to be the second best side in the world has taken a little bit of a battering, and now I think that after this series, it really is looking on quite kind of marshy ground, to be honest. I think that India will say, look, we're the side that's matching Australia. We're the side that's going toe to toe with them. We're the side that's going to challenge Australia in this T20 World Cup. And the excitement around that. I mean, we saw the clips of the fans and things. And the fans got in for free into those games. So commercially, you could argue that wasn't necessarily so successful in the terms of if you give away the tickets, of course. But they were genuinely excited people, right? You can give away a lot of tickets and not get that level of excitement. There's a real excitement around what India are achieving at the moment, and if they can carry that into the T20 World Cup, then the battle between that ultimately happens. What a fight! If that T20 had been the final, the T20 World Cup,
that would have been amazing.
That would have been just like the game that really because that was the one disappointing thing about the last T20 World Cup, wasn't it? The final. Although Australia were awesome in the final, India just folded. But if they can now really match them, then that's just fantastic for the game as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the thing about giving the tickets away for free is quite an interesting thing, isn't it? There's a bit of a debate, and there has been a debate particularly in women's sport over the last few years about the extent to which that's a kind of a good thing to be doing, a helpful thing to be doing. The people just then don't bother to turn up because they haven't committed any finances. But getting 45,000 people into a stadium to watch India play Australia in the women's T20, that does feel like a genuine breakthrough moment. And I think that's actually, in a way, doing that and offering the tickets for free has actually been quite clever. potentially, because what's going to happen now, and what we were seeing on social media was people saying, I turned up at the stadium and I couldn't get in because they'd already sold, in inverted commas, all the tickets, or they'd already given all the tickets. So I wasn't able to get in. So now people are going to really see it as an event. They want to be there. They don't want to miss out. They don't want that experience of missing out to happen again. And so next time, if they do actually then put the tickets on sale at a kind of reasonable price, then you would hope that those people would still be really keen to get in, because they're going to think, oh, well, if I don't go, then I'm going to feel like I've really missed out.
FOMO.
Yeah, definitely. So potentially that strategy could end up paying dividends for Indian women's cricket. So, but how exciting to see those kind of crowds, especially obviously because it's a bilateral series. We have seen big crowds in World Cup matches, but these are the kind of crowds that you don't see very much still for bilateral women's cricket. So it's fantastic. And we've always, people have said a lot that India is that kind of untapped market for women's cricket, and it feels like suddenly they're waking up to it. So that's very exciting. Now finally this week, Sid, we did have a question from Ben on Twitter. He says, would you please consider on the pod going into why BBC TMS, for example, couldn't cover England women's series in the West Indies? Is this a cost issue for the BBC? And it's obviously on BT Sport for the lucky people who can afford that, but there hasn't been any free-to-air coverage in this country, has there?
Yeah, now when I first heard about this, my instant reaction was, well, TalkSport have the rights for cricket in the West Indies in terms of radio broadcast. Do they not, Raf?
Well, that's what we thought, but then I saw a tweet from Jonathan Norman, who's the TalkSport cricket editor, actually as a reply to somebody saying that women's cricket rights are sold on their own account. That was a direct quote. So basically what he's saying is TalkSport only have the rights for men's series in the West Indies to broadcast the radio coverage in this country. So BBC, if they wanted to, could have kind of got the rights and broadcast the series. Now, I think that's interesting, but from the BBC's perspective, I guess what they will say is, well, it was very short notice, right?
Yeah, there was not much time to organise anything because we didn't know where the games were taking place until quite late. So that does make it more difficult. The other thing there's a little bit of an elephant in the room here as well, which I do want to raise, and it's a bit of a difficult one for kind of anyone talking about women's sport to raise, but I'm gonna go there, Raf, and that is this: that it does cost real money to send TV or radio people to do these, to cover these games. It's costing. It's not nothing. You have to pay people, you have to pay for the equipment, you have to pay for them to be insured, you have to pay, if the BBC wants to cover it, they'd have had to pay some fees to West Indies cricket. They probably wouldn't have been huge, but it all adds up, right? Now, a couple of years ago, when the Women's Football League, the soccer league in this country, got a new deal, which was paid for by Sky and the BBC. That deal's worth $7 million a year. So it's $7 million a year from Sky and the BBC, and we don't know the balance between the two because they never released the information of who paid how much. But between the two, they're paying $7 million a year for women's soccer. Now, that's fantastic for women's soccer, but that sucks all the oxygen out of the room for everybody else, right? Because the BBC's budget is not limitless. The BBC's budget, the BBC, for those that don't know, is funded by a licence fee, which is a sort of compulsory tax paid by every household in the country. And the government are very reluctant to allow the BBC to raise that licence fee, so the BBC's budgets are fixed. The BBC is being kind of attacked by inflation and by the poor economy in this country. So it's hard to find that money, and it's unfortunately even harder to find that money if you've given $7 million of your budget between BBC and Sky to the FA to be able to cover women's football. So there's unfortunately, the success of women's football is genuinely, it has to be said, a negative for everyone else. There just isn't the money in the BBC, and BBC Sport just don't have the budget to be able to send people to cover everything, unfortunately. And that is the hard truth that we have to accept, that in this country in particular, women's football is just so dominant, sucks the oxygen out of the room for everybody else, and actually genuinely makes it harder for everybody else, because there is not an unlimited budget. Sky can't just raise their subscription fees and to cover showing some women's cricket. If Sky could raise their subscription fees, they'd have done so. They haven't. there isn't the capacity there to do that.
Okay,
So
I
it's
hear what
tough.
you're saying, but it's funny how the BBC always managed to find some budget to cover like really obscure men's series.
That is true. They were able to send plenty of people to cover the Pakistan series.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I just gonna take that with a
Yeah.
slight pinch of salt, Sid. But it's an interesting point that you raised nonetheless. Okay, let's wrap up there.
Okay.
Thank you, Sid. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you in a week's time for a special Christmas episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.